I recently released 2 gaming PC build videos onto my channel, and whereas both were sweet spot price to performance gaming PCs, one was an all new PC using AMD Ryzen, and the other was an all used PC based on the Sandy Bridge platform. Now on paper, both of these systems should perform pretty similarly, but that becomes very interesting when you consider that the Sandy Bridge PC cost about half as much and is about 6 years older than the AMD Ryzen PC. So what we're going to do here today is put these two systems head to head in some gaming benchmarks to decide which is the best gaming PC. Hey everyone, this is Frank. Welcome back to Jaeger Tech. Today the question isn't necessarily just the new versus used Showdown, but also a good question of should I upgrade my system? And I'm sure a lot of people are still on the Sandy and Ivory Bridge platforms just because there hasn't been a massively compelling reason to upgrade until Ryzen really. I think Ryzen has made a big splash and made a lot of people start asking that question, and we want to answer that here today. So we're not only going to do these two systems against each other, but we are going to directly compare the 2500K to the Ryzen 5 1400. But let's cut the fluff, get into these two combatant systems before we start talking about the benchmarks. So the Ryzen system has an R5 1400 CPU, so that's 4 cores and 8 threads, and I've overclocked that to 3.8 GHz. That's running alongside 8GB of DDR4 RAM that I overclocked to 2800 MHz and a GTX 1060 that I overclocked to 2088 MHz. Those are all reasonable overclocks. Pretty much anyone can attain those overclocks, I do believe. I even used the stock cooler that came with the R5 1400 CPU. Over on the Sandy Bridge team, we have an i5 2500K. This was a pretty big processor back in its day, and it's still pretty hardcore today. It's got 4 cores, 4 threads, and I've overclocked that to 4.8 GHz. That's running alongside 8 gigs of DDR3 at 1333 MHz and a GTX 970 overclocked to between 1500 and 1550 MHz, depending on how GPU boost is feeling. Now we've got the specs out of the way, let's jump straight into the benchmarks and see how these two systems perform. Before we hit the gaming FPS charts, I just want to see what synthetics will tell us. And in Cinebench, unsurprisingly on the multi-core Cinebench run, the R5 1400 just takes it away because it has hyper-threading. It scores a hell of a load more than the i5. But on the single core, as you would expect, the i5 pulls away because it has a much faster clock speed. So when you're only using 1 core and the R5 doesn't get to leverage all of those threads it has, the i5 2500K takes the win. But how will that translate in game? Will the i5's single core performance just let it tear apart the R5? Well, Firestrike would suggest otherwise. In the graphics and physics test, the Ryzen system takes the win, and the overall score, it is also ahead by a good few hundred points. Now, Firestrike isn't the be all and end all, and it's definitely not a substitute for gaming, but I do find that it is relatively accurate in depicting gaming performance in different systems, except in this case. When we look at the gaming performance, let's start out with Shadow of Mordor. So Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, reasonably intensive game, is quite well optimized, so you get pretty good differentiation between different systems and their capabilities. And when comparing these two systems, we have a clear-cut win for the Sandy Bridge system. It takes it away by just 6 FPS. It's not a massive margin, especially when we're talking 110 to 120 FPS. It's actually quite small, but it is a win nonetheless. Shifting over to Battlefield 1 starts to tell a very different story. The Sandy Bridge PC starts to really pull away here and takes a clear lead of around 11 to 12 FPS. So that's over 10%. That's pretty significant. Moving on to Grand Theft Auto 5, I know a lot of you love this game, always want to see it in the benchmarks, and it is very CPU intensive, so I think we can all see what's coming here. I was wondering if the R5 1400's 8 threads were given an advantage here, but that simply isn't the case, and the 2500K just cleans up. Over 20 FPS difference, that's a difference of 90 to 113 FPS, and you cannot understate a difference of about 20% gaming performance. In Total War Warhammer, the difference narrows, but the Sandy Bridge system definitely still takes the lead here at 110 FPS compared to the Ryzen system's 102. And finally, we're going to end on PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, a very popular game at the moment, and I'm sure a lot of you are eagerly waiting for this result. So here it is. The Sandy Bridge system pulls in 90.9 FPS, whereas the Ryzen system only manages 61.3 on average. That is a shocking difference. The Sandy Bridge system pulling in literally 50% higher frame rates than the Ryzen system. It's a clear win across the board for the used system. And I mean across the board because when I paired the GTX 1060 with the i5 2500K, I saw lower FPS across the board than when it was paired with the 970. So the 1060 actually performing worse than the 970 in this case. And it wasn't just the massive clock speed of that i5 carrying the 970 on its back. The 970 was in fact pulling its own weight. I'm going to quickly interject here because I realised while editing this video that I left out a crucial piece of information. And that was that the reason I paired the i5 with the 1060 was so that I could directly compare it to the Ryzen 5 processor and see how they compared head to head. And I'm sure some of you will be interested in the results of those tests. So in Shadow of Mordor and Total War Warhammer, the gap between the two processors started to narrow, so that even though the i5 was still winning, it was by a relatively insignificant margin. However, in GTA 5, PUBG and Battlefield 1, the i5 still won by a very significant margin. And so I still have to give the win on which is the better CPU for gaming to the i5 2500K. But that's all, I'll let you get back to watching the video. If you're looking for the best price to performance for gaming, then I think the i5 2500K is really hard to beat, even when you factor in that you have to pay extra for an overclockable motherboard and an adequate CPU cooler to cool it while it's overclocked. I think it just with those overclocks being able to get so high, you really struggle to beat it. And pairing it with a GTX 970 is just price to performance perfection. But you are giving things up. There were no USB 3.0 ports on my 1155 motherboard, and you'll never find an M.2 slot on one of those motherboards either. However, both of those can be solved by expansion cards that plug into PCI Express slots on your motherboard that will give you that functionality for a little bit of extra money if you really need them. However, you are still giving things up, like DDR4, so that's high capacity and higher speed RAM. Also, you're giving up a pretty decent upgrade path. So with Ryzen, you have an upgrade path of up to an 8-core, 16-thread CPU if you ever want to get into more multi-threaded workloads. Whereas on the Sandy Bridge system, you're limited to 4 cores and 8 threads. That's a huge limitation when you think about it. Another big difference is power consumption. The i5 2500K consumes way more power than a Ryzen 5 CPU does, causing it to run hotter and louder than the Ryzen 5. Ryzen is really efficient. And that's one of the things I find most impressive about this release is just how efficient those CPUs are. It was able to run cooler and quieter with its tiny stock cooler and heatsink than the i5 did with that massive aftermarket cooler. That is insane. Alright, here comes the actual conclusion. Should you upgrade your Sandy Bridge or similar platform PC to a modern platform? Probably not. If you're happy with it, stick with it. And quite frankly, you should be happy with it because it is an awesome platform. It performs great and it's just great to work with. But if you're building a system now, then don't feel bad about buying new parts and paying extra cash for them because there are a lot of benefits, even if you don't consider warranty, which I think is definitely a bonus. And it actually takes a lot less tinkering and messing about to get it functioning at its maximum performance. So one of the problems I had with the 2500K system is whenever I had to reset the CMOS because my overclock was unstable, I had to go through and change a hell of a load of settings just so it could boot into Windows because things like AHCI and EFI weren't enabled by default, so it wouldn't even boot into Windows without messing with the BIOS. Also, if you were to pay for like a 1500X instead of overclocking a 1400, You wouldn't even have to overclock your system to get that performance that I had today. And that's pretty compelling. Like, these turbos out of the factory nowadays are getting really depressingly good for people like me who like overclocking. They're just taking all the fun out of it. But it's great for consumers who want to get all the performance they can. So if you want a system that's easy to set up, easy to overclock, or might not even need overclocking, and has all of the modern features right out of the gate, then Ryzen is definitely for you, and I would happily, highly recommend it. But if you're a tinkerer, if you like overclocking, if you are happy to buy used so that you can get the absolute most FPS for every penny that you spend, then an older platform like Sandy Bridge is an amazing choice. It's so much fun to tinker with and mess around with an overclock because you can get so many megahertz out of these CPUs. Even today, when they've probably been abused their entire life, they are still fantastic. And you get such an amazing feeling to take something like this system and overclock it to the point where it outperforms a system of twice the price. It's just such a fantastic feeling. I cannot recommend it enough. That's it for today, everyone. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and hope you found it interesting. I definitely found it interesting. I mean, I thought the Sandy Bridge system was going to win, but not by that much. I thought that the systems would trade blows a lot more than they did. So I definitely found these interesting. Let me know what you thought of the results down below in the comments. Let me know if you were surprised or not. And also check out my channel. You can actually watch the build videos for the two systems here today on my channel. They were a lot of fun making. I hope you enjoy watching them, and consider subscribing if you like the videos there. Other than that, rate the video down below. And this has been Frank Yeager with Yeager Tech. Have a good one. So the i5 2500K compared to the Ryzen 5 consumes a ridiculous amount of power. That's a bit excessive.